Good evening, my friends, and well, anyone else there who likes. My face is looking especially bright this Tuesday evening, and I welcome all of you back to what is slowly but surely going to be sort of like closing down on terms of a lot of the Chris and articles. And we're going to start off this evening with Chris and Oratory, otherwise known as Oration, otherwise known as Chris being a dignified speaker. Now, with that being said, I know what you're probably thinking of, is that there has been some very, very well-spoken and very, very outspoken men and women throughout the ages. Chris, on the other hand, well, we'll get to that in a second, but first, here's this really nice quip from Quintilian on the education of the orator, 1.5.1. Style has three kinds of excellence: correctness, lucidity, and elegance. For many include the all-important quality of appropriateness under the heading of elegance. Whenever Chris wants to make an argument regarding his opinions, one way he'll attempt to move people is through orating, his reasoning to them. Since Chris lacks some of the basic skills needed to make an effective speech, rarely ever plans out anything he makes, has serious communication problems, and never does research, his speeches always turn out lackluster at best and horrifyingly naive at worst. This could be due to his autism, since communication effectiveness is often affected by it. Well, unless of course you have a lot of experience in terms of just speaking your mind, and well, it's kind of one of those things where it's neither really for or against. If you can, it is absolutely possible to actually speak your mind actually really, really effectively. I mean, certainly one of the things I did when I was growing up is that I actually did quite a lot of drama classes and tried to deliver poetry classes after school. So you do sort of get into a bit of a practice somewhat in just, it's again, because I had an interest in that sort of thing anyway, going through school, you sort of learn how to become more effective and not only being able to speak clearly, but speaking in such, well, like they said, with the quality of appropriateness under the heading of elegance. Now, with that being said, there is a bit to this, so let's get started, shall we? Chris as a public speaker. Chris often struggles to speak in a coherent manner that can convincingly hold an argument. Some of the reasons are as follows. 1. Inability to communicate properly. Chris has been known to sometimes have issues making his points clear. His heavy speech impediment, brought on by autism, makes him incredibly hard to understand at times. He also, unfortunately, often seems to space out or lose focus mid-sentence, and repeat a lot of his points when he can't think of anything to say. His orations often include adaptations from other people's or characters' speeches, since Chris seems to have a difficult time being creative and original, and so they often turn out somewhat disjointed and weak. He almost always seems to get it right whenever his speech involves rage or wanting someone to die, since all Chris can think about in those speeches is getting his goal accomplished as soon as possible. This indicates a very physically focused style of thinking, also possibly a symptom of his autism that prevents him from communicating theoretical ideas easily. I would argue very strongly is that sometimes I feel like a lot of Chris's speeches regarding the things that he does talk about are usually quite a lot of the things that Chris has no real experience in. I mean, you want to take a very basic example, guys? During the Casey saga, well, Liquid Chris, I should say, Chris constantly said in several videos that he loved Casey. But a lot of these times, Chris came across somewhat, let's say, unconvinced. And it has led to a lot of people suspecting, if you will, does Chris actually love Casey? Or is Chris just saying that in a bid to win over Casey? Now, with that being said, one of these days we will get into an actual article about Chris and, well, love. And it will be very, very interesting to see what you guys think. But what do you guys think? Do you think when it comes down to some very basic for theories of mind. When it comes to love, when it comes down to the things he's actually interested in, like video games. But then again, I feel like this should be also... What I'm basically trying to say is that Chris has a good way of, staying in his lane. And Chris will I think at times, try and divulge and try and talk about slightly more complex or complicated, I should say, ideas. But unfortunately, Chris talks about them as though they're just easy to come up to a conclusion with. Although, to be honest, Chris a few years ago would have just labelled this as, well, the dimensional merge will sort it out. In many of his speeches, Chris also tends to use very fancy-sounding words to make himself look more intelligent than he actually is. Chris seems to think that by using obscure words, or by making up phrases composed of existing words and affixes, his speeches mean more than they actually do, and people will think he knows what he's talking about. Unfortunately, however, this often has the opposite effect, especially if Chris is using the word in the wrong way, as he is known to do. And if the person listening to the speech isn't already familiar with Chris's strange vocabulary, they'll be completely lost. Lack of self-awareness. Be the change you wish to see in the world. A quote which Chris should have taken advice from. And for those who don't understand even the context of this quote, I'll just try and spell it out. Is that ideally you want to be you want other people to see you as a beacon of hope, something that people can aspire and look up to. That's essentially what it's trying to go for in a nutshell, and it's a good one. Don't get me wrong. There are some, however, phrases that I feel like people coin a lot better, but or at least coin rather differently. But, well, I don't know. A good quote is a good quote, and I do quite like me some quotes, to say the least. Despite wanting to change the world. Now, actually, I have to first pause with this. Is that, do you really feel as if like Chris wants to change the world though? Because I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I think Chris, more than anything, just sort of wants to... I thought the whole point was just Chris wanted to like write a quirky little comic book, and then develop, and then expand upon it, and what we'll see it turn into a video game franchise and then a movie franchise. I don't really feel like... I'll be honest, most comic book writers and authors and artists, they do aspire to become famous, but why not just settle for, like I said, stay in your lane first, baby steps, and then see what happens. Just putting it out there. Chris rarely ever seems to attempt to change himself. Well, that is quite true, I must be honest. You're very rarely the same person going into an industry as you are when you come out of it. Whether for good or bad, one of the most important aspects of a public speaker is their willingness to not only change the ways others think, but to also change themselves. Therefore, an effective speaker would always be aware of wherever their argument or reasoning falls flat. Instead, Chris, who often speaks and thinks with a somewhat inflated ego, never looks into his overall character. He tends to treat his good qualities with care and attention, and completely overlooks a majority of his bad ones. The only times he mentions his bad qualities is whenever he feels the need to pity of people more fortunate than him to make himself feel useful. Because of this complete lack of self-awareness, it is very hard to actually follow any type of advice Chris will give, given his inexperience in these same things. It also probably doesn't help Chris's cause that quite a lot of his more infamous quotes more sort of highlight his level of arrogance. None more fitting than, firstly, you wish you were me. Now, to be fair to Chris, maybe Chris really... I think this... Well, I was about to say, you know what, to be fair to Chris, but no. Because, let's face it, most people... There are loads of people who are really, really good public speakers, but who are undeniably arrogant. And Chris is just such a case. Now, I've also made quite a splash, if you will, trying to actually do commentary, not on so much politicians' policies or their agendas, but also about how they best communicate their points and opinions. And for those living in the UK, a slight tangent, but I promise we'll get back on board. The current leader of the UK Conservative Party, known as Kemi Badenoch, I have gone on record and said that, well, here's the thing. Somebody once asked her last week about what they thought about the Netflix television series Adolescence. Kemi Badenoch said that she didn't watch it and she feels that there's more important things going on in the UK right now than what's going on Netflix. Now, of these things, you may have picked up on one or two things. Is that, in my opinion, any politician, or in fact, I'll go one further, the leader of a major UK political party, they should be they should be trying to flatter and trying to engage with people, be they the public, reporters, tradesmen, worksmen, that sort of thing. They should be trying to flatter and be courteous towards their quarry in order to win them over. But one thing I have never been able to get away from, especially when it comes to Kemi Badenoch, is that a lot of her responses come across as very abrupt and not particularly forthcoming. And if you want more, if you want a stronger case, ladies and gentlemen, Kemi Badenoch was the same woman who straight up said that there's far more to that bringing culture into the UK goes it's not good enough for fashion or food is not enough in terms of culture coming over to the UK. Now the problem with this one, I'm sure you can probably work out, is that first of all, well, what would Kemi Badenoch prefer to see coming over then? And also, well, what's wrong with the food or the clothes that they bring over to the UK? Don't be a snob. And unfortunately, the Conservative Party, for those who have lived in the UK since at least 2010, or at least who've observed the political climate, is that, well, the Conservative Party is literally full of downright snobs. And boy howdy, are they incredibly snobbish. And it's not a good look, ladies and gentlemen. And, well, even as a Labour Party member will tell you, looking smug, looking, snobbish, and straight up looking rude are never ever good looks. And you don't really need to go too far to explain why. But if you do honestly want to win people over, I would say, keep it very, very simple. You treat other people as you would like to be treated. Especially if you are going into something that with no real prior research. But at the very least, you should have some level of self-awareness in terms of maybe who you're speaking to. Because it may surprise some of you to learn, and we'll get back on track in a second, is that about a week and a half ago, I actually applied to go on a little-known show on the BBC called Dragon's Den. A show in which I have to sell my business idea to 5 multi-millionaires, and well, it certainly has given me a lot of experience in terms of trying to practice how to speak in a very, very convincing, but also in a very factual point of way. Now, with that being said, there's no guarantee I'll actually get on the show. And despite I'll probably never meet Evan Davis, but you know what? It's not without trying. So, getting back on track, never doing research. In order to get their point across, a strong orator must know a lot about what they're trying to prove to their audience. This means doing extensive research on that given topic and evaluating their current stance on the topic whenever contradictory evidence comes to light. Chris, unfortunately, often neglects this part of the process due to bad habits, because of how little research Chris does to make a point and having lived a very sheltered childhood. Chris seems to base his points on many logical fallacies, childlike beliefs, his past experiences, and baseless assumptions. Even when he does do research, that would be a first, wouldn't it? The arguments he makes will typically fail due to him misrepresenting or misinterpreting claims made in his sources. Whenever he does research, his preferred sources seems to be Wikipedia, which many people do not recommend as a secondary source, given how anyone can edit its articles. Even if Wikipedia itself was a credible source, that could be used to make a strong argument. Chris will often cherry-pick whatever proves his point the best, ignoring all of the other parts of the article. This has even gone so far as, well, Chris asking a comic book writer on Twitter about what the name of this current Earth's dimension is, and despite the fact that Chris never considered the idea that, again, they were entirely fictional, which Chris based his completely baseless methodology about the dimensional merge and C-197 and all of this nonsense. Habit of lying. Most importantly, for any public speaker, they need to be someone who can be trusted by the general public. Given how often Chris lies, it is difficult for his speeches to have credibility, and so lose a lot of their communicative power. The law of non-contradiction and liar's paradox give reasons to disbelieve someone who lies even once. Some examples of his lies, specifically those in spoken presentations, comprehensive list is also here, are as follows. 1. Chris said Blanca Wise received the medallion and sent it back. This was of course a lie, since Chris had made a new medallion and the old one had been publicly destroyed. 2. Chris has made occasional claims that he really doesn't hate homosexual men, despite several instances of him showing otherwise. 3. Whilst technically not lying, Chris's moving of the goalposts when it comes to Liquid Chris's credibility as the true and honest Quick is incredibly damaging to Chris's image as an honest and credible person. This includes the SingStar Challenge. 4. Chris went to great lengths to tell the fans that he would never show gore and violence in his comics. However, he breaks the statement by killing Evan in a very gory fashion in Solitude issue 10. He later insists, his first chat with Jackie, that it was justified because Alec gored it up first. Episode 17, which was written long before Aspertu even began, ended with Rosechew stripping naked, clawing a man's head open, electrocuting him, and leaving him in a puddle of his own blood. 6. Chris promised to remove himself from the internet, only to return less than 48 hours. Common traits of Chris's speech. Rage. Chris often has a very black and white view of people and evil, tending to be viewed people as his enemies if he doesn't even like them, even if the situation is vastly more complicated in nature. This, and his lack of tact when it comes to his stronger emotions, be they true love or hate, unfortunately, because Chris does tend to lash out at his people with insults, death threats, and obscenities. This behavior even got his C-Chan Solitude YouTube channel taken down at one point. The extent of what Chris might say to his offenders is ultimately unpredictable. Sometimes Chris will only go off on a tangent on how much of a dirty troll his offenders are, and will rage thinking that will work as an effective way of changing their minds about conducting the behavior that was angering him. Other times, Chris will absolutely despise a person's guts so much that when he orates about their dastardly deeds, he will want the person in question to either suffer or be wiped off the face of the earth entirely. Threats. Chris sometimes will threaten his audience in an attempt to get them to do something to better themselves. Interesting tactic. Or that will some way benefit him. In the video, That Is My House, he demands all of the trolls to delete everything they found out about Chris's house off the internet, and even goes as far as threatening the law onto them. Also, during the Clyde Cash saga, Chris has made several attempts to blackmail Clyde in a series of videos where he's threatening to Clyde to stop trolling him. In some of these other videos, Chris tries to make Clyde look like a pathetic weakling and makes himself look like a Herculean chick magnet. while he was threatening him to have a fight with him. Also, now listen guys, I know what you're probably thinking. Chris wouldn't need to resort to threats or violence if Chris had just, ignored all of this entirely, or rather had taken steps to improve his behavior, because, as proven in previous articles, Chris did kind of bring a lot of this onto himself. I mean, try and tell me where Chris's autism works into, his degradation and borderline racism when it comes to saying that he can't date a black woman. Try and work that one out, because bear in mind, guys, well, Chris is not Alexis Texas. Let's get that right. Chris thinks as though he thinks he's God's gift, and he really does think that as well. And Chris thinks he's just better than that. Again, why on earth we need to? Chris is like, you know what Chris is? Honestly, when it comes to oration, he is the reverse Andrew Tate. Chris is someone who is so full of himself, but he is an absolute, he is so low effort. But his methodology is not really that different when it comes to Andrew Tate, from followers to worshippers to building an empire of absolute degeneracy. And Chris's runs in with the law. Well, then again, I suppose, to be honest, Chris is probably more borderline low effort Kanye West. And yes, guys, I have heard that Kanye has also done some really messed up things in his time, for reasons I will not be getting into. But, well, if you want to look into it, well, just be warned, you'll probably lose a part of yourself. Bias and one-sided arguments. Chris has certain behaviours that can be seen as very stubborn. His refusal to change himself or his beliefs are often a detriment to him. And yes, we do say to him, it doesn't really come at the expense of anybody else. This means that regardless of what evidence you give to him that suggests he's wrong, guess what? He'll always try to find some kind of information out of thin air or a fallacious argument to further his very beliefs. Or verify, I should say. Whenever he gives a speech, oftentimes he doesn't ever think about why other people might not agree with his opinions, or he won't think about the kind of people that might not benefit from his opinions. You see, something that Chris struggles with is that, well, from the very face of it, Chris has an issue with, regarding the logic about his own arguments. You see, in many ways, you would agree with me when you would say this, that if you're going to make a point about it, there should be a logical reason as to why people should be agreeing with you. But there should also be, in many ways, you should be able to follow a trail of logic as to why someone may disagree with you, which is often not easy to do for some people. But let's play a little game. Let's come up with an example. Let's say Chris has a very legitimate trail of thought when it comes to the dimensional merge. Okay, so it's the trail of the logic here is that it's because of what Chris believes, and well, that is that. Unfortunately, it fails in pretty much in a one-sided debate, because why don't other people believe this to be legitimate? And Chris does. Why can't other people believe it? Or why can't other people see the way Chris sees things? And if Chris is trying to say, there's a very simple reason for it, it usually only ever boils down to, Chris is right, and other people are just trying to belittle him and make him look small. Chris, and this is something you do hear from very egotistical persons, is that they usually will say, whenever people ask him very honest and legitimate questions regarding their methodology, that they are being attacked and that they're just trolls who are trying to get a rise out of Chris, despite asking pretty bog standard questions. Oftentimes, he doesn't think about why people might not agree with his opinions, or he won't think about the kind of people that might not benefit from them. This seems to be a symptom of some level of narcissism, which he has developed over years of enabling by his parents. Logical fallacies. When majoring in CAD, Chris never ended up taking any classes in rhetoric, so Chris oftentimes falls into logical fallacies in his many rhetorical pieces. His arguments usually end up very unsubstantial as a result, with no relevant evidence in many instances. The following examples illustrate logical fallacies common to Chris's videos and speeches, and give examples for each. Ad hominem. Chris may sometimes misguidedly rely on insults and hominem arguments to argue a point. This is where someone may say something, such as accusing him of being homosexual, and then Chris, instead of arguing against that point using reason, will insult the person's character. This, of course, is a fallacious method of argument and does not verify Chris's sexuality at all. For instance, in the video Kill de Jacques, Chris argues that 1. The homosexual ads are inappropriate for his website and should be replaced with something else. 2. Clyde Cash's billboards contain false information. 3. Chris is straight. However, the arguments he uses are: Jack makes Chris sick, Chris mocks Jack, Chris says Clyde is lazy, Chris appeals to an imaginary audience saying he's not the only one sick of the ads, Chris says Jack is a sniveling coward, Chris says Jack is poor, Chris slanders Clyde and attempts to deplatform him, and then flips the bird at Jack. Not a single valid point was made. And bear in mind, on top of all of that, Kill de Jack was released December 24th, 2009. Yeah, Merry Christmas indeed. Straw man arguments. If Chris is arguing against something airtight, he may choose to misrepresent the argument and instead argue against a malformed, flawed version of that argument created in his mind. These were used a lot against the troll who intellectually challenged him the most, Alec Benson Leary, who wanted Chris not to use Evan Christopher George's Simone Chu character. When Chris had gender-bended into Simone Rosechew, it was very hard for Alec to keep the argument on track, as Chris was so frequently using Simone Chu as a straw man, saying even Evan can have his Simone Chu, when Alec was clearly talking about Simona, which makes the Alec Benson Leary calls particularly hard to listen to, since Chris's incessant use of this fallacy was so annoying. Well, on top of the many other things that Chris was failing to answer logically, such as Christian Love Day. I love the Alec Benson. To be honest, again, bit of a controversial thing to say, but in terms of the trolls over the years, I legitimately do think Alec Benson Leary is my absolute favourite. Because, if for no other reason, there were absolutely at moments when Alec was not really a troll. Well, he wasn't really a troll when you sort of think about it, because he was trying to ask and try to follow Chris's trail of thought, but because Chris's trail of thought makes no sense and there is no logic behind it apart from Chris legitimately will just take whatever he likes as long as he's not required to say please about it, then go for it. It's the exact sort of thing that got Chris kicked off the Sonic World Discord mod back in 2020. Moving the goalposts. Chris has a habit of not thinking his demands through, or otherwise let his ego get in the way of reality. This will sometimes cause people to easily prove themselves correct by Chris's standard, thus winning the argument. By default, it would seem. However, in retaliation, Chris will, instead of admitting defeat, redefine the specifications and requirements of evidence, which makes the process of him being proven wrong an endless cycle of being presented with evidence and demanding more. This allows Chris to believe that any of his misguided delusions are true without allowing evidence to prove otherwise. A fantastic example of Chris's employment of this fallacy was in the Liquid Chris saga. Chris would set goals for Liquid Chris to reach in order to prove that he is the true and honest creator of Sonichu, and even though Liquid continually achieved these and proved that he was the true and honest creator of Sonichu, Chris would never afford him the credit he deserved. Instead, Chris would just say that the proof didn't matter because he said so. And in order for him to prove his legitimacy, he must fulfill the next goal. This is a very good example of moving the goalposts, especially since Liquid Chris didn't actually create Sonichu in the first place. The only reason Liquid could so easily fulfill Chris's demands was because they weren't asking for actual relevant evidence, but instead were egotistical assertions that he was the only person who could speak Spanish, disproven in a video by Liquid in which he shows a solid grasp of not only Spanish but numerous other languages, or could sing. It's an incredible example of this logical fallacy interacting with Chris's narcissism. Notable speeches from Chris. A series of commentaries on Chris's notable speeches, focusing specifically on Chris's ability to communicate, body, language, and rhetoric. Christian Western Chandler's future message. Chris's future message speech is a solid example of Chris's early oral works. Not a euphemism, by the way, featuring a lot of the problems listed in this article, and Chris's somewhat problematic beliefs. It was filmed on his 25th birthday as a sort of set of proverbs and imparted wisdoms that Chris had accumulated throughout his life, that he wanted to pass to future generations. Chris was very confident and proud of this speech, as can be noted by his intention to have it shown in local schools. However, he has never been approached with any kind of offer for it to be displayed anywhere. Yet. I think even the University of Phoenix Online even took a pass at this. But communication issues. Chris is holding a piece of paper on which his script is written, and relies heavily on it, often neglecting to look at the camera, causing the communication to not be as effective. A better public speaker would usually try to maintain eye contact with their audience. Yet, you know what, this is even Roosevelt, who was crippled with polio, got this right. To keep their attention and to seem personable. Usually by either learning the script, knowing what they want to say, and just improvising around that. Placing or holding the script in a position where it can be glanced at without having to look away from the audience. Or using more subtle note cards with pointers to remind them of what to say, making sure to maintain eye contact throughout. Throughout the video, the many pronunciation problems that Chris has are on full display. Saying the word example as estample and relaxing as relasting, as well as generally slurred speech which is spoken too quickly to be effective. Chris also shows his regional dialect as well as his wit with the phrase, "I am here and y'all are there." Interestingly enough, the hand sign Chris uses to illustrate his oration when saying that it is his 25th birthday is holding up 3 fingers. This makes the communication confusing, as a good public speaker is often sure to make sure what they go with their hands match up with what they are saying. Many of Chris's gestures used throughout his output are meaningless on their own, only present to convey rhythm and emphasis. Chris's stuttering is also exemplified here. When he talks faster than his brain can think, which is easy for him to do since he has a tendency to speak fast, like children usually do, and doesn't seem to have an easy time constructing sentences in his head. He says the wrong word, and often goes back a few words to say the clause again to correct the mistake. An example of this being, "Today, intend to share some wise words." Chris taught himself saying the wrong word, and so corrects himself. The amount he does this varies heavily on how hard he finds the sentence to think of. Luckily, the script helps him know what to say if that happens, so it doesn't happen as much in this particular video. The parts where he stutters most is where he goes off of his script and makes a side comment such as, I haven't done, and I don't like it, doing either of them. Rhetorical problems. Chris uses a litany of rhetorical devices to put across his points, such as calling cigarettes death sticks and saying he would like to send all of the tobacco that exists to the moon on a rocket. Chris also takes a negative stance on alcohol, saying that it is a slow-acting poison. However, these arguments fall somewhat flat when he uses himself as an example of the benefits of not smoking or drinking, fit as a fiddle. When Chris is indeed not dead or suffering liver problems, he isn't exactly a portrait of good health, being unfit and overweight at 25. The use of good examples is extremely important in rhetoric and public speaking in general. If Chris let go of his ego, he'd be better off citing straight-edge celebrities. Yeah, but then again, some people may call straight-edge somewhat boring, but, well, Chris is hardly, either of those things, let's face it. He was at least one of these things. Or at least until he doubled down on it. Or, what's not doubled down, doubled up on it, I should say. Is there a phrase that say, like, double up? No, I don't think so. Anyway, moving on. Chris also speaks out against gender transitioning and intimate relations with the same gender. Unfortunately, this argument doesn't really have much to stand on, as Chris merely makes a somewhat feeble and lazy appeal to authority by involving the name of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, a 1950s sex researcher. He also mentions the big man upstairs, presumably himself referring to the Christian God, which Chris believed in at the time. Since Christian marriage is between a man and a woman, and premarital sex is prohibited, making same-sex relations a sin in general. He also claims homosexuality can really jeopardize the entire future of the world and the human race, which is completely untrue and baseless, since LGBTQ plus people are in the minority and can still reproduce through surrogacy. None of these arguments are good or well supported enough to be taken seriously. And bear in mind, guys, not even to be taken seriously even by 2007 standards, let alone 2025 standards. Chris insists that women are not to be so picky when it comes to finding a partner, as well as this showing that Chris seeks to undermine female agency and self-esteem. It also is a transparent attempt to get women to have a relationship with him out of pity. This is an abuse of his platform as a public speaker and really undermines a lot of his points. Chris could improve his public speaking a lot by becoming more humble and respectful of other people's wishes, and unfortunately did not manage to provide good enough citations for his points. In conclusion, we can see from this example that both of Chris's ability to communicate and rhetorical discourse is ultimately flawed, and would require a lot more speech therapy and communication training, as well as rhetoric lessons to control. The autism tutorial. Chris's autism tutorial is another good example of Chris lecturing a large group of people on a widespread neurological condition, but without researching the subject correctly or using effective techniques in his points. It also displays rage responses and insult responses, so you can get a wide range of these techniques. In most of this video series, Chris neglects to actually talk about autism, its effects on one's cognitive functioning, how neurotypicals should treat people on the autism spectrum, and seldom gives appropriate or recommended advice. When he isn't telling parents of autistic children to mainstream their kids and irrationally hating on a part of the spectrum for no discernible reason, not even discernible reasons in the video, he is giving very incoherent and convoluted speeches. Here are just a few of his speeches he gives in the video series. Fellow autistic people, I encourage you to man and woman up. Subtitle, it is socializing in real life or dust, respectfully. Go out into the real world and make real friends with full, great quality friendships. Do it now. In this speech, Chris doesn't seem to account for people who are much lower on the spectrum and therefore can't socialize with others like he demands them to. He also doesn't seem to grasp the idea that all autistic people develop differently, hence why it is called a spectrum in the first place. Because of this, despite being somewhat incompetent at socializing himself, he thinks that if he just acts as a role model and tells all autistic people to go out and just talk to people, their disorder will magically become manageable. I feel dislike towards you for selfishly putting your ill name in association with autism, and with a name like Asperger. I feel it only makes us autistic kind sound even worse. Asperger's, you should have left it as it was. Autism is autism, and in your research, you linked it up with psychopaths. I feel even more offended at that. Now get out of my sight. Yeah. Well, I feel like I had to put that in somehow, but one of these days I'm going to have to do an entire elongated video talking about everything, and I do mean everything wrong with the autism tutorial. What is it a tutorial to, by the way? Because it's called an autism tutorial, but it doesn't actually introduce us to anything about autism. Anyway, due to his lack of research on Hans Asperger's contribution to the understanding of autism, him twisting and cherry-picking what he did finds out about Hans's research, and him failing to realize that Hans was autistic himself, Chris seems to view Hans as the culprit behind his and other autistics' lack of appreciation from anyone, simply for naming a condition after himself and having it sound like Asperger's. In his juvenile mind, also somewhat failing to realize that Asperger's is only a part of the spectrum and not another name for it, and therefore takes great offense at it for no real reason. No way, imposter. The public message from Chris is aimed primarily at Liquid Chris, but it is also a message to the wider public and companies who Chris seems to think could stop Liquid from selling merchandise, when it's, unlikely that they would even take his side. Chris employs a number of tendencies mentioned in this page throughout the video, but obviously none more prevalent than threats and blind hatred. Chris notably babbles and stutters a lot less when making this video than some of his more relaxed orations, but can have some serious problems when his mind wanders or has particular trouble with a sentence. A notable example of Chris having a stuttering problem is at the 046 section, when attempt to use staccato-like phrasing to get across his point powerfully, it seems to backfire as he forgets which order the words are meant to be in. Stop that brown striped in the shirt with the paper medallion. Threats and harmoniums. Chris throughout the video is very impassioned and aroused, not a euphemism by the way, and is neither subtle nor eloquent. His performance style involves a lot of hand waving, raised voices, and lots of threats and insults. Chris first makes the threat of suing Liquid. This is assuming that he has grounds to sue, and for that he would need more than the copyright registration of electronic files named Sonichu. Other than the very empty threat of legal issues, Chris also makes a very vague death threat in the form of "die you," and also attempts to use black magic to put a curse on Liquid Chris. It should come as no surprise that merely yelling "you are the imposter" is not a valid argument, and is simply used as an intimidation tactic to get Liquid to voluntarily stop selling Sonichu merchandise. But Chris seems to believe that Liquid can and should go to jail for his actions, although "die you" is technically a death threat. It is very unlikely that Chris will make an attempt on Liquid's life, and doesn't seem to really be threatening to do so. Just telling him to die is a little too vague, even though it's the intention of it is pretty clear. False equivalencies. Chris, in this oration, uses false equivalency liberally in his rhetoric, causing many confusing moments and points. The first being his copyright on Sonichu, which is not a trademark, is a grounds to sue Liquid. Admittedly, it is a generally accepted that Chris is too naive to realize that he has no legal grounds to make such a threat whatsoever. But it is a false equivalency nevertheless. The second false equivalency is that Chris, having sent Nintendo a letter and given them over $5,000, means that Nintendo know who Chris is and will be willing to stop Liquid from selling Sonichu merchandise. The third false equivalency is that the true creator of Sonichu is the one with his address, his phone number, and his parents. This also counts as a circular argument. By the way, that's a double logical fallacy. The fourth is somewhat similar to the second, but Chris also claims that the company of Nintendo had known him his whole lifetime, because he bought stuff from them. Chris even claims that Nintendo would kick Liquid out. Out of what is a very good question. The fifth false equivalency is that Liquid should have the police called on him by companies or his fan base and thrown in jail to rot, even though it is very unlikely that Liquid would ever make enough money to get life in jail by selling Sonichu merchandise. Probably I could, and, well, nothing would change. Activism. Being an opinionated and even confrontational person, and how, around the subjects that he is very passionate about. Chris has engaged in many campaigns on the many platforms that are available. Chris has been observed to conduct activism for a number of subjects, from local issues about saving McIntyre Park to international issues about Sonic's arm colour. Chris is proactive about protecting the things he loves, except Sonichu, interestingly. Twitter campaigns. Twitter is one of the many public platforms that Chris uses as his soapbox to speak to the world. The 280 character limit can't stop Chris, as he'll sometimes make a thread, which is a longer speech, comprised of many linked tweets. These are used especially prevalently in his Twitter campaigners. In these, Chris will use his platform to deliver rhetorical pieces on certain issues he is rallying behind. These are mostly triggered by trolling, being blocked, or because someone hasn't followed his orders, no matter if it's an individual or a company. Hashtag harass Quick directly. On the 1st of August 2017, Chris made a post for National Girlfriend Day where he gathered up all of the gal pals he had made on Twitter. In this particular post, he tagged Planet Dolan voice actress and artist Doopy Doover, whose Twitter posts Chris replied on a regular basis. Doopy, seemingly unsettled by Chris's possible labeling of her as a gal pal and using the pet name Darling, made it clear to Chris that she is a stranger to him and that he should back off. Despite this obvious message, Chris took it to meaning that Doopy won't befriend Chris because of her influence with the trolls, rather than because of his inappropriate behaviour. Chris then came to the conclusion that Doopy wanted to stay away from him because his trolls were supposedly harassing her and the rest of the Planet Dolan crew. Chris has even went on to justify his rationale by saying that Doopy was upset and directed her anger towards the wrong person. Despite this happening much later, and Doopy straight up saying, Chris, this was your fault and don't talk to me again. Chris, upset that the trolls were supposedly trolling his new friend, created the hashtag campaigns harass Quick directly and don't harass me. The next day, to direct all of the trolls that were trolling Doopy to him, and even made a video scolding the trolls for harassing other people for their enjoyment. Because of Doopy eventually blocking him, Chris retired the hashtag on the 4th of August 2017. Block the trolls. On the 28th of August 2017, after being stressed out by his conversation with Lady of the Cosmo, Chris, thinking he is in no way responsible for the bad things that happened to him, made a post regarding how the trolls have recently made him feel off. After making this post, he made a long-winded speech about how good should rule over the evil that is the trolls. He eventually followed the Twitter hashtag #BlockTheTrolls. His arguments mostly consisted of false equivalencies. He compared himself to a hero defending the Twitter user he liked, attempting to invoke emotion by naming heroes like Sailor Moon and Optimus Prime. In reality, Chris was more like an affectionate and over-enthusiastic dog with fleas coming into someone's house, and getting very confused and angry when he was thrown out. Chris is confused about why he would be rejected, when the person could just comb all the fleas out. But the fleas reproduce and get everywhere, and Chris simply isn't worth keeping. This gaping flaw in his argument causes the speech to fall flat, resulting in 80% of people voting in a poll he made that it was the correct choice to just block Chris, as it is easier. The My Little Pony protests. And isn't that a sentence? On the 13th of August 2018, after Hasbro announced that their popular children's TV show My Little Pony would end their 4th generation TV show, Friendship is Magic, and proceed on to a 5th generation, Chris, believing that he had prophesied that there would be 5 more seasons of Friendship is Magic, started protesting against it. His rhetoric here is frankly awful. Not only is he appealing to authority, but he's appealing to his own authority as a CPU and also as an all-powerful goddess. However, Chris thought that this was a very good argument, and it would be if he actually was an all-powerful being. But unfortunately, Hasbro has yet to respond to this protest. I think there was a stronger outreach for there being a 3rd season of Young Justice, or to continue Attack on Titan, than there ever would be for My Little Pony Gen 4 to continue. Some examples of poor rhetoric include, I have seen a future that we must prevent, My Little Pony Generation 5. Nobody will take this level of reasoning seriously. I just did a reset to prevent that from happening. You are unable to rewrite the canon of a TV show by saying something, and it is frankly ridiculous that Chris thinks that he should have this level of power in his fictional universe. CPU Blueheart commands it so, and in argument with Princess Celestia, appeal to the authority of an OC and a character that Hasbro created, neither of whom exist. And reboots hurt the original very bad. Reboots stun growth of the original. More baseless and factually incorrect information. Note that Chris uses the words hurt and growth here in the sense of effectively a living being. Not just the reboots of shows make the original worse. Chris often mentions that Equestria will be damaged or hurt, and he wants G4 to continue for its safety, but it is a very poor veil hiding his true desire, to not have anything change about Equestria, since it undermines his delusional views of how C197 and fictional characters work. Facebook campaigns. Before Chris started using Twitter as his main platform, Chris used Facebook as his public platform. In the months and years after he stopped making YouTube videos, as much as when Bob died, using this platform started a few campaigns about the things he was very concerned with at the time in his life, in the early Tomgirl stages. The Sonic Boom protests. In late 2014, it was revealed that the latest iteration of Sonic, Sonic Boom, would depict Sonic as having blue arms, as opposed to the usual tan color, which was integral to Sonic's iconic design. Despite the non-canon nature of this game and series, Chris took serious issue with the nature of the redesign. Chris wrote letters and took physical action during his campaign, but also conducted a campaign on Facebook. In his speeches, Chris will often use capital letters to portray shouting. These parts are often where he is at his most rhetorical inept. For example, this is an example of why Chris says Sega should waste lots of money on a recall of the whole Sonic Boom franchise. Sonic's arms are not blue, and they are seriously causing sensory overloads in me. Chris calls for boycotts and mass calling campaigners among the masses to get Sega to recall the franchise. And if you're not sure whether or not Chris is calling for this and expects Sega to comply explicitly because he doesn't like it, this is what he recommends people say. The very sight of Sonic's blue arms makes our ally, Christian Western Chandler of Ruckersville, Virginia, suffer from consistent sensory overloads. Upon seeing them, his brain immediately shuts down into a momentary to lengthy, depending on how long he is forced to displeasingly endure the horrific sight, state of mental paralysis. Yes, Chris thought and expected that everyone was angry about the color of Sonic's arm because specifically he didn't like it. It doesn't seem to matter to him whether other people like it or not, and this has an extremely negative effect on his rhetoric and ability to communicate. This position of severe narcissism often alienates Chris's audience in his speeches. This and Chris's tendency to issue death threats eventually caused him to be thrown out of his own Facebook group. Also, starting a new Facebook group, these alienating and polarizing speeches further caused Chris to be pushed back by all those who agreed that Sonic's arms should stay tan, eventually calling the campaign a success when in the next Sonic game his arms went back to tan, despite this not being the goal of the campaign. Braziers for males. In mid to late 2013, Chris created a Facebook page on which to campaign about making braziers socially acceptable and encouraged for men to wear. Chris, while not really giving a very good reason for wanting to do so, does however show his best display of rhetoric throughout his campaigns, presumably due to the help of somebody else. His reasoning and thought processes are well set out and developed, shockingly thanks to the page's administrators who were helping Chris's arguments become more well put. For example, the original About page was very well considered and offered many convincing reasonings that it should be socially acceptable, such as sports bras prevent the chafing commonly experienced by joggers, bras can provide support and relief for the wearer's chest and back, some conditions cause males to develop larger breasts, which is often a case of embarrassment, bras designed for males, or sports bras in the appropriate size, can flatten or lessen the appearance of male breasts and help the wearer feel more confident. Many males wear undershirts to accomplish this purpose, often with suboptimal results. Some males enjoy wearing braziers as an expression of gender or sexual identity. Though this is a valid use, it is not the focus of this page. Anyone who wants to wear a bra for whatever reason should be free to do so. So far, so good. This very well thought out and thought-provoking set of reasons was almost certainly not said by Chris. But it is a good backdrop on which to contrast the direction in which Chris takes the page once the administrators stop controlling him as much and Chris uses some of his fallacies and confusing dictation. For instance, this quote, which is extremely bewildering. Ryan Gosling wears a man bra. Okay, so maybe he doesn't, but we can't know for sure. Rather than appealing to people that socially acceptance of men wearing bras is a good thing, he's merely asserting that it is socially acceptable already by appealing to authority, and then suggesting that we can't know for sure means we should consider it as acceptable already. That's 3 fallacies in a very short passage. In late 2014, when the page was picked up by Chris after a long hiatus, Chris didn't have the administrators to help him at all, and so quickly developed into something vastly different, and didn't last very long, as I'm sure you guys can work out, proving that the campaign was really over by this point. He came out as transsexual and told men they should wear skirts as well as bras. These arguments weren't quite as well formulated, and seemed to indicate something a little bit more darker about Chris's views towards men as well as towards women. In the comic. At some points in the comics, many of the characters will give a speech regarding their opinions on the current situation. Whether this is just a result of sheer laziness, well, yeah, it is just out of sheer laziness, let's be honest. Other times, Chris will use these same comics to write speeches of his own. The comics turn out to be a very good source for learning about Chris's orating skills. Chris often displays many of the rhetorical devices outlined in this page, framing distortions of reality that suggest that people he doesn't like are worse than they really are, and that he is more virtuous than he actually is. He uses a lot of ad hominems, which is merely to serve in order to make Chris appear to be more vindictive and egotistical character than he would like his readers to believe. For example, towards the end of episode 17 in Sonichu 8, Sonichu gives a speech about how Jason Kendrick Howell is not triggering Chris by giving Rosechew a pickle, but how doing so completely drags both his and other United States citizens through the mud. Even though Rosechew is not a political figure, this is an example of Chris using false equivalence to put the point across that it is immoral and illegal to portray Rosechew in this way. Chris also uses a rhetorical question which uses heavy extrapolation to imply that disagree with him is a dishonor to the country. Chris is also using a false appeal to patriotism, because drawing art of a fictional character has no bearing on the United States, and his attempt to suggest it does is disingenuous. And finally, Chris occasionally will lose focus and go off on quite drastic, jarring tangents, by providing extensive exposition about something. This really ruins the flow of his speeches and makes the point less poignant and punchy. Ultimately, pacing suffers a lot in these speeches of Sonichu due to these errors. And considering Chris had intended for these things to be written for children, actually writing things for kids to understand, well, they come across as more speeches that would be delivered in something like South Park, as opposed to something in a sort of comic that I imagine Chris wanted to do. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that was Chris and Oratory. And one thing I do kind of want to point out just before we go is that, well, maybe it's because the only reason Chris even bothered to address his audience in YouTube videos in the first place was because more out of a sense of trying to set the record straight as opposed to, well, having any desired interest. But then again, if Chris really was just trying to set the record straight, he could have just done it in a few words and then moved on about it. Some of the best speeches in the world, ironically, are the ones that are short and to the point. Something that Chris never is in any of his speeches. And that's something I would probably like. I would love to do a lot more of those sorts of things if I ever started giving out speeches for any reason whatsoever, short and to the point. And, well, with all that being said, I hope all of you guys enjoyed this article, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. So take care, and bye-bye for now. Well, hello again. And just before each and every one of you leave, if I could just hold your attention for a few more seconds, and I want to show you very quickly my Patreon store. I've been running this for 5 years now, and ever since this month began, I have decided to reopen, relaunch, completely sort out my categories for videos, and I've uploaded them sometimes as far as 3 months in advance. So you guys will be able to get an exclusive look exactly what's coming out, when it's coming out, at your convenience. So make sure to stop by, take a look around, and let's see what you think. Thank you very much for supporting me once again, and I'll see you again next time.